right, guys, can you hear me, or do I have to get closer to the mic? I'll yell. Hi, welcome. This is our first of two presidential related meetings in a week, and neither one of them is about impeachment. Isn't that nice? Did you know there was such a thing as a discussion of the presidency without impeachment? Well, there is. And so today we're going to talk. We're going to talk at length about the book Accidental Presidents, which I hope you'll buy afterwards, which is actually, I just want to say a few things about the book because it's actually a fun read. Okay? It's actually like just good old-fashioned, it's kind of fun that the Google guy is the old-fashioned, like wonderful, you love history. You're like, I got a story to tell you. And it's great. And it made me a little jealous, I just have to say. And so maybe I'll have to go back to being a historian. But anyway, it's a terrific read. And then next week, on Monday night, we have an event on presidential misconduct, but not about necessarily impeachment. I just want you to know that. Presidential misconduct through all of the presidencies from the very beginning, George Washington, until not now, right before now. And it's a book that was released originally in 1974 during the Watergate hearings, and in response to the Watergate hearings, and obviously being reissued with all the presidencies in between being written about, all by sort of, mainline historians. And so we're going to have a bunch of those historians here, some not who wrote for the book, but who've written about the presidency, to talk about how to understand presidential misconduct. I also want to say that this is the first time we've co-sponsored an event with somebody else at Fordham, which is really nice. We're co-sponsoring with the Fierick Center, which, by the way, they should have been the only sponsor. We're just kind of tagging into their expertise, but as I have a particular fascination with the presidency, so thank you. Thank Dean Fierick for us. Thank John Rogan. And we're excited. Without further ado, let me introduce, we're having a dual moderation, by the way. We've never done that before. So I'll introduce Jacqueline. Jacqueline Barkett went to Fordham Law School, studied here, worked with us at the center, went on to work in the Department of Justice in the National Security Division, and actually on a lot of issues at the Department of Justice. She is now working here at the Eastern District of New York, and she will be joining the center for the next year or so before she goes on to bigger and better things, or maybe not. She won 2 awards this year for her work at the Department of Justice, and so you'll be seeing much more of her, but this is kind of the beginning of her association with the center. And last but not least, Jerry Cohen. So Jerry Cohen is somebody you may or may not have heard of, but you should have heard of him. Usually I talk about how I first met somebody, but this is how I first met you, so I won't do that. But Jerry Cohen's somebody who's been was first talked about to me by a number of my colleagues when I first started the center at NYU. And many of them came from policy planning, where he worked at the State Department. Others came from other parts of government. Would just say, listen, there's this guy you got to meet. He's really smart. He likes history like you do, and you got to meet him. He knows what's going on. So now I'm finally meeting him. Originally, he wrote a book on jihad that we were going to discuss, but that was many years ago. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He's from Connecticut, like I am. That's important. He went to Stanford. He got an MPhil at Oxford in international relations. He's written several books, one of them co-authored with Eric Schmidt of Google. Probably not as delicious as this one in its historic details, just kidding. He worked in policy planning. He worked both for Condoleezza Rice and later for Hillary Clinton. He worked at the original think tank at Google, which was called Google Ideas, which now has become a very different sort of entity that does research development, thinking about cutting-edge problems, about cyber risks, from anything from cybersecurity to misinformation. That's a big portfolio, right? At Jigsaw. So he knows a lot about a lot of things, but interestingly enough, what he decided to write about was accidental presidents. And what I want to know is, well, I think what everybody wants to know is, why? Why did you want to write this book? And I know that somebody's asked you that before.
It's actually a very fun question to answer. Thank you for having me here. This is probably my favorite topic to discuss, and impeachment does make multiple appearances in my book, so we can go there if you want to. But this is my fourth book, and anyone who hasn't known me my whole life, when I told them I was writing a book about the 8 times in history a U.S. president has died in office, now history was changed by the beat of a heart, it made no sense to them. So their first reaction was, oh, is it a book about technology? No. Well, is it a book about foreign policy and geopolitics? No. When I would tell them, they really would look at me puzzled. Now, in contrast, when I told my sister I wanted to write this book, she says, yes, that's the book that I always thought you were going to write. Why is that the case? Well, my parents, when I was 8 years old, they bought me this children's book called The Buck Stops Here. It's one of those rhyming books, 1 page per president, and I still, my parents wanted to turn me into a precocious kid, and what I latched onto was the 8 pages about death, 4 of which were about murder. So my poor parents had to have this conversation with me about death and murder as an 8-year-old, and I still remember the rhymes, right? 35 is young John F., another president shot to death, right? These things sort of stick with you, and so I was sort of obsessed with this my whole life. I started collecting presidential buttons. There was a downstairs room in our house that I turned into the Kennedy room because when the Oliver Stone movie came out, I was dissatisfied and decided I was going to solve the Kennedy assassination. And this wasn't a particularly digital time, so it was literally pictures with thumbtacks and yarn connecting them. I'll jump right to the punchline. I did not solve the Kennedy assassination, as you are probably aware. But I spent my whole life reading books about the presidents who died in office and the presidents who ended up taking over for them. So I've really been fascinated by this. And I started writing the book 6 years ago. Donald Trump wasn't in the mix. Nobody was talking about impeachment. Nobody was talking about presidential power. Nobody was talking about the 25th Amendment. By all accounts, it was a pretty boring chapter in presidential history if you were interested in the sort of smuttier aspects of it. And throughout the course of writing this, it just became more and more relevant. And the question of why, after all these years, did I decide to start writing this? When my wife was pregnant with our first of 3 daughters, it made me think about my own childhood a lot, and I just kind of got excited about my childhood interests. And I always sort of think of my career as a portfolio of curiosities, and I felt sort of overly positioned on tech and overly positioned on foreign policy, and I wanted to diversify my portfolio with a little bit of presidential history. And I needed a project because I was annoying everybody. So I decided to do this. I put together a proposal. Simon & Schuster decided to take a risk on me as an unknown historian, or amateur historian, and I was off to the races. I fast forward to my second daughter, my wife being pregnant with our second daughter, I got stuck on the Garfield and Arthur chapter, and we couldn't think of a middle name, so my middle daughter's middle name is Garfield, after James Garfield, who was shot to death after 4 months in office. So if she doesn't like the comparison later on, we can tell her it was the cartoon character. But the last thing I'll say about this is I wanted to approach this project, through the lens of somebody who loves history. I wanted to write it as I would have wanted to hear it from somebody else, and so it's written in a playful and casual way. It brings alive some of the kind of crazier and more sensational aspects of our history, but it does also give a snapshot of American history. I mean, for me, it was an incredible refresher course of so many parts of our history that should serve as a valuable frame of reference for what we're experiencing today, and a reminder that things sort of manifest in a different kind of way, but there's not a lot that is totally new. And for all the talk about constitutional crises and so forth, I actually think the most sustained constitutional vulnerability in the history of our republic is the fact that when it came to presidential succession, the founding fathers and the drafters of the Constitution really gave it very little thought, and that we basically winged it throughout history. I mean, it took 8 presidents dying in office and 4 to be assassinated for us to formalize a precedent that was set in 1841 that the vice president becomes president. I mean, Lyndon Johnson becomes president on November 22nd, 1963, based on a precedent that John Tyler sets in 1841. So we just kind of were very casual about it, and we got very lucky in that they were mostly a mixed bag, and you only had one catastrophe.
So, tell us who the hero of this book is.
So I don't know if I would say a hero, but I think it's, there's definitely, when you sort of grade the 8, and but what's fun about this is most people don't know who the 8 are, so bringing alive some of the lesser known characters in history was also quite fun, and it's daunting to think, what can you possibly say about Lyndon Johnson that Robert Caro hasn't said, or what can you possibly say about, Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson and many historians. So I sort of had a mini freak out at the beginning of each chapter. And there's a reason why I didn't include Gerald Ford, but what I like to joke with people is I was just burned out and tired. But I really did want to focus on presidents who died and transitions that happened unexpectedly as a result of death, because that sense of deprival, as opposed to a man-made transition that comes from scandal, I think is a very different kind of experience. But if I had to look at the best of the lot, and I hope we'll do the worst of the lot too. So while Theodore Roosevelt is my favorite president, and is probably the only of the 8 that would have been likely elected president anyway at some point, the most successful of all the accidental presidents is the one that in many respects was the least prepared for the job, which is Harry Truman. So, if you look at the Democratic Convention in 1944, Harry Truman was kind of a last-ditch effort by Democratic Party bosses because they didn't want Wallace. Everyone knew FDR was a dying man. Anyone around him, it was painfully obvious to them. You read their memoirs, you read later interviews with them. They knew it, but they didn't talk about it. And I actually don't think FDR was, my editor always says don't get inside their head, but I don't think FDR was in denial about it, but I think that he prolonged acceptance of it by just not talking about it, and if he wasn't going to talk about it, nobody else was. But they were certainly aware, because their behavior at the 1944 convention shows they understood a level of seriousness around who the vice president was. So they didn't want Wallace because they found him to be a Soviet sympathizer, and even for the Democratic Party bosses, they found him too liberal. And then the other characters in the mix, they just were worried about whether or not the Democratic ticket could win with them for a variety of reasons. So Harry Truman ends up being the kind of anti-Wallace choice. He's a provincial politician from Missouri who's barely left the country. He has a little bit of baggage with some machine politics, but he's kind of a pretty simple, safe choice, and he's the best way to make sure Wallace doesn't become vice president. What I write about in the book is how they took an initial voice vote on the second to last day of the convention. By all accounts, Wallace had the nomination. He gave arguably the greatest speech of his career, and they were so convinced that the A votes had it that they flung open the doors of the convention hall to let people stampede in, abruptly called a fire hazard, and had somebody grab an axe and chop the organ pipes that were playing the theme song of Wallace's home state. And they came back the next day and they literally set up checkpoints and roadblocks to not allow Wallace supporters into the convention hall. And then Truman ends up getting the nomination. So Truman spends most of his, so if you look at his 82 days as vice president, he only meets FDR twice. He never steps foot in the map room where the war is being planned. He doesn't get a readout on Yalta. He learns about it at the same time that FDR delivers the readout in the joint session of Congress. He doesn't meet a single foreign leader. He's not briefed on the Manhattan Project. He's basically out socializing. And what's startling about this, in his own memoir, he talks about getting a phone call 2 weeks into FDR's fourth term, saying the president is dead. And it was actually one of the president's advisors who was dead, but he had this moment to contemplate himself as president, and it was about roughly 5 minutes before he realized it wasn't the president who was dead. And there's no evidence in any of his letters and his own memoirs and anything that I've seen that this went anywhere other than in one ear and out the other ear. So April 12, 1945, Truman gets a phone call while he's on the Hill, and this time he doesn't know what it's over. He's just told he needs to get to the White House pretty quickly, and there's no evidence that he suspected what the call was about. He thought he was about to get berated for something at the White House. So he walks in. So for some period of time, he doesn't know he's president. He goes up to the second floor, and Eleanor Roosevelt puts her hand on his shoulder and says, "Harry, the president is dead." And he says, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And she says, "Is there anything I can do for you, for you're the one in trouble now?" And he really was in trouble. If you think about what Truman inherited on April 12, 1945, there's never been a president in history who has inherited more of a difficult hand with less preparation than Harry Truman. So at that moment, the Battle of Okinawa was raging. And this was the type of battle where literally every minute, every moment mattered. One of the fiercest, if not the fiercest battle in U.S. military history. There was a bureaucratic feud between the Army and Navy that threatened the entire war effort. He got briefed on the Manhattan Project 30 minutes after taking the oath of office, and what people don't realize is it took several subsequent briefings for him to really understand what this was. So he had to grapple with the fact that there was this incredibly destructive weapon which may or may not work that he might have to consider using. He had to deal with the fact that he might need to move 1 million men from the European theater to the Asian Pacific theater. Stalin was reneging on every single one of his promises from Yalta, and keep in mind Truman didn't really know what happened at Yalta. And he had to deal with the complexity of Winston Churchill, which I think speaks for itself. So what did Truman do in his first days as president? He literally is in the map room where he's never been before, and he's learning where these countries are on a map. He's getting caught up on, the war. He's getting caught up on the European theater, the Asian Pacific theater, and on top of that, every one of the individuals involved in the war effort in FDR's cabinet was a larger-than-life figure, the Dean Achesons of the world, the George Marshalls of the world, and so forth. So Truman basically is studying in his first several days, and yet in his first 4 months and first 9 months of his presidency, he makes some of the most important decisions in the history of our republic, and then the war effort shapes the post-war order. And it's just remarkable how quick a study he proved to be, how decisive he proved to be. He had the wisdom to know who to listen to when. He benefited. He was lucky in the sense that the George Marshalls and the Dean Achesons of the world, despite being Europeanists and very different from Harry Truman, believed that the fate of the world rested on his success as president, which was not a fate that Lyndon Johnson enjoyed with the Kennedy advisors. So there's a little bit of luck, a little bit of skill, but it's just a remarkable presidency for a man who inherited so much and was so ill-prepared.
Well, on that note, and still, talking to lines with Truman, one of the lines you say in your book is that Truman had said when he finally became president that the magnitude sobered him, and he said, "I was beginning to realize how little the founding fathers had been able to anticipate all the preparations necessary for a man to become president so suddenly." So taking us back to that first moment, you start the book with John Tyler sort of being a trailblazer, and that he insists that he be treated fully as the president, even though nothing sort of suggested any sort of interpretation of that sort in the Constitution. Do you think he got it right? Do you think he got it wrong? What did that lead us to? What consequences did that lead us to today?
So it comes down to, I love talking about the first time that this happened, because you can't fully get in the founding fathers' head, but my best guess is I don't think they intended for the language is very vague. It basically says in case of death, resignation, or removal of the President of the United States, the same shall devolve to the Vice President of said office. So there was real debate around what it means to devolve and what the same means. In looking at the deliberations from the Constitutional Convention, first of all, they didn't want a vice president. They added a vice president as an electoral mechanism, and it was only with the 12th Amendment in the early 1800s that the vice president, electors cast their ballots separately for the president and the vice president. So they really viewed it as just an electoral mechanism. I don't believe that they intended for if there's a vacancy in the president, for the vice president to be anything other than an acting president. And to go a step further, if you look at the Presidential Succession Act of 1792, which deals with the problem of a double vacancy, they say that if there's a double vacancy with the president and the vice president, that at the time, the president pro tem is an acting president until the next scheduled election. I think that's a good indication of their intent here. But nobody really thought about it. It's amazing because James Madison was on his deathbed when he was president. This was the first. I should say that there were 19 times the president almost died in office through either accident, illness, or assassination attempt, and these are like real close calls. And they sort of get lost in the annals of history, and they're fascinating. So James Madison was deathly ill for about 3 weeks, and they began succession proceedings in the Senate for what to do with Vice President Gary. And Dolly Madison gets wind of this and writes a letter to the Senate basically saying her husband has made a miraculous recovery, which was complete BS, to use the language in my book. And he ended up making a miraculous recovery 3 days later, but she wanted to stop those proceedings from happening. Then Andrew Jackson is shot at point blank by a man named Richard Lawrence, who thinks he's the king of England and is actually a painter. He's shot at point blank. The gun had a 1 in 125,000 chance of malfunctioning, and then Andrew Jackson beat the living daylights out of him with his cane. But in neither case did anybody speculate about what would have happened had either of them died. So that brings us to the election of 1840, which is really the first modern election, brings the first elected Whig president into the presidency. Henry Clay is ecstatic because he thinks he's got his Manchurian candidate. And then William Henry Harrison dies after 30 days in office. John Tyler had been thrown onto the ticket to carry Virginia, which they lost, and to appease states' rightists, which didn't happen either. So he, basically, planned to spend 4 years in irrelevance. So William Henry Harrison delivers the longest inaugural address in history, and then John Tyler skips town to his plantation, sort of never to be heard from again, until 30 days later when the president dies. Now I should clarify that the historians say that he died of pneumonia, but about 5.5 years ago it revealed that he actually died due to a sewage problem around the White House that likely killed him, James Polk, and Zachary Taylor, which is a subject for maybe a grotesque science project. So John Tyler hears about this, and he knows that the cabinet will insist on him being acting president. He's the only one that thinks he's president. So through a combination of rail, steamboat, and horse-drawn carriage, he races back to Washington, sits down with the cabinet, and insists that he's the president. They disagree with him, and he keeps insisting. He sort of bullies them into, kind of taking the oath of office, and then he's in a fight with Congress for 2 months, who's insisting that he's the acting president, not the president. He sets the precedent that he is the president. He's called His Excellency. He's called the Great Usurper. He, for the rest of his life, returns mail unopened that describes him as acting President Tyler. And the Whigs, end up with a situation where they have a president who's really a Democrat, who doesn't subscribe to their agenda. They ultimately excommunicate him from the party. He becomes the first president to be formally kicked out of his own party, the only president to be kicked out of his own party, and ends up with no path to election in his own right in 1844 because the Whigs don't want him. And the Democrats are mad that he ran as a Whig in 1840, so he does what any sort of ostracized president would do to try to find their own path, which is he, intrigues to annex Texas, to try to throw a wrench into the mix and give himself his own path. Now, the interesting twist of this story is the precedent that he set is responsible for Millard Fillmore being president, Andrew Johnson being president, Chester Arthur being president, Theodore Roosevelt being president, Calvin Coolidge being president, Harry Truman being president, and Lyndon Johnson being president. It's a very important precedent because had the precedent been set the other way as acting president, there's a lot of things that would have happened in the history of our republic that could only happen with somebody having the status and recognition of being president. But a story that I spent an enormous amount of time on, like deep down a rabbit hole, is February 28, 1844, John Tyler is on board a ship called the USS Princeton, and this is kind of like the gala of the season, and it's to celebrate American naval practice and the fact that he had just covertly consummated the final agreements to negotiate the annexation of Texas. So it was a big celebration, and then there was a woman half his age who he was in love with on the ship as well, and he was a widower president, and so he's very excited about this. So as they go by Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, they decide in tribute to the late president to fire a gun called the Peacemaker, which was the most sophisticated sort of cannon/long gun of its era. The gun explodes. It kills the Secretary of State, who was responsible for the covert annexation of Texas, so that falls apart several days later. It kills the Secretary of Navy, who was responsible for the naval buildup. It kills several ministers, ambassadors. It killed John Tyler's favorite slave, whose mother was compensated $200. It kills several senators. It kills more senior officials than any other moment in history. So more senior American government officials died in that ship explosion than anything that's ever happened in the history of our country. It would have killed John Tyler had he not been down below deck flirting with the young Julia Gardner, who was more interested in the captain's son. So they hear the explosion and they go up the ladder. She goes up first and she sees that among the dead is her father, who's a New York State Senator, David Gardner, and she collapses into the president's arms. He sweeps her away. They walk down the gangplank. She wakes up when they're walking down the gangplank and doesn't know what's going on, and nearly knocks them both overboard. They would have fallen so far that fall would have killed them. So the president almost died a second time. This goes back to this sort of double vacancy. Remember, John Tyler had set this precedent, which was deeply unpopular, but had he died in that explosion, I'm almost certain that his precedent would not have held. Because you would have ended up with the president pro tem, a man named Lafayette Sabine, a man named William Maxey, as the acting president, and it would have really changed the course of history. But this ship explosion is like one of these utterly fascinating, kind of hidden chapters in American history.
So I want to ask a question that's a little bit more interpretive, which is, do you think, because I was waiting the whole time through the book, okay, what are your big conclusions about, is it good or bad to have an accidental president, right? And so I guess my question to you is, do you think that any of these I have an answer, by the way, so I'm just saying. So do you think that any of these accidental presidents change the presidency? Not the definition of succession, or of secession, but the actual presidency itself. Because it seems to me that if accidental president is mean to connote don't go down this road, which we're going to get to, and is there somebody who, not elected to be president, became president, and because of who they were, changed the nature of what we understand the presidency to be?
I mean, I think they all changed it, because with each. Remember, the vision was not for a strong chief magistrate. That was something that evolved over time, and in many respects, I would argue that the fact that these men were accidents. All of them had one thing in common, which is so none of them enjoyed a close relationship with the president who was deceased. None of them were integrated into the administration. So none of them really felt like they owed anything to their predecessor. One of them, Chester Arthur, had to go into hiding for 2 months while Garfield was on his deathbed because everyone thought he was responsible for the assassination because he actually met with the assassin. So each of these men, very few of them subscribed to the policies and the views of their predecessor. So a lot of them, sort of ascended to the presidency and wanted to make their own mark, wanted to get out of their predecessor's shadows, but more importantly, wanted to win election in their own right. And with the exception of Calvin Coolidge, most of them became, and LBJ sort of more in the middle, but most of them ascended to the presidency at the very sort of closer to the beginning of the term. So they ended up getting close to a full term. So they all change. I mean, you just go through it. I mean, because Henry Harrison died in office, you had John Tyler introduce the idea of the President of the United States using covert tactics for the first time to advance policy, without informing Congress. That led to annexation of Texas, which gave us war with Mexico, which created an imbalance in free and slave states after we won the war, which made civil war much more likely to happen. The death of Zachary Taylor and the ascendance of Millard Fillmore unblocked the Compromise of 1850, which delayed the Civil War by 10 years. I mean, Andrew Johnson, we were supposed to get Abraham Lincoln's vision of Reconstruction. Instead, we get a man who was born a racist, died a racist, last president to own slaves. When he took his vice presidential oath of office, was so drunk that his 30-second speech turned into a 17-minute diatribe where he insulted every single member of the cabinet except for the Secretary of Navy, whose name he couldn't remember, and then went to swear, put his hand on the Bible, and instead slobbered it, dropped it, and almost passed out. And then when he was asked to swear in, the new senator said he was, he didn't feel like he could do it, and asked basically the equivalent of an intern to do it for him. So you could argue that that new class of senators in 1865 were illegitimate in the sense that the vice president never formally swore them in. And if you just go down here I would argue that James Garfield was maybe the one man who had the potential to reverse the tide of Jim Crow, which, obviously the precursor of that was the Black Codes, but Jim Crow really starts, closer to 1876, and Garfield is the only man to get the presidency without running for the nomination in the first place. And one of his big platforms was universal suffrage and universal education, and Chester Arthur just wasn't up to the task. I think Theodore Roosevelt fundamentally changed the nature of the presidency as it pertains to foreign policy. I think Calvin Coolidge introduced a real model of laissez-faire presidency. I think Harry Truman increased and I think each successive president from Truman to LBJ that was an accident dramatically increased the role of the president in foreign policy. And I think that's not a coincidence, because there's sort of a legislative weakness that comes with being the president who wasn't elected. And you could argue there's a correlation between them asserting themselves in foreign policy and that weakness.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Do you want to ask the follow-up?
No.
So we've talked a lot about the historical context of the book, and I'm sure that we could talk for another 2 hours, but we only have 20 minutes, so we'd like to sort of move it a little bit more to contemporary times. I know we want to ask you a little bit about impeachment, but also, just as a follow-up to what you were just discussing, the role of vice presidents, and I think the way that people usually think about vice presidents or running mates. I know that myself personally, when you're sort of looking at the range of candidates, you're sort of matchmaking in your head, oh, well, maybe Biden will run with so-and-so, and then maybe that would be a good team or something. But I don't know if anyone really gives full consideration and due for who that vice president is and whether or not they care. What do you think we should do about this? How do you think we should change this conversation?
Yes, I think it's interesting. We fall into this trap every single election. And I would argue this election is extremely important for this right now. Because if you think about it, we're in the longest period of time without a president dying in office. We have the oldest incumbent in the history of the Republic and the oldest president in the history of the Republic, and the person leading on the Democratic side, depending on what poll you look at, and the person running second, depending on what poll you're looking at, are both in their 70s, and one of them had a heart attack, and one of them, partisan statement just looks old, right? So we're older than when he was vice president. It's an issue. It's talked about, right? So I don't think, again, I'm not passing. I guess I am passing judgment, but I'm just parroting what I hear elsewhere. So it doesn't matter who the vice president is. I think this could be good for vice presidential selection, because this reality really should force us to look at the vice president through the only lens that we should look at it through, which is this somebody that we would be comfortable with leading the country? Absent extremely old candidates on both sides that sort of force you to imagine the president dying, much as the Democratic Party bosses did in 44. The tendency is to look at the vice presidential selection as a marriage of political convenience to win a state or appease a constituency, and it doesn't. The historic evidence suggests that neither of those things really ever happen perfectly, that people don't turn out for the vice president. They turn out for the top of the ticket. The caveat to that is we've done very little experimentation with race and gender, and we've had Geraldine Ferraro, but we've not experimented enough of this to really stress test that hypothesis. So that's the one caveat. It's just really different today. I mean, historically, you could argue that the VP had a more tactical role during an era where the nominations were, so this is before primaries and things really played out at the convention, and the choice of a VP was a way to bring delegations along when this was all playing out in a matter of days, because for most of the history of our country, the president, top of the ticket, didn't campaign. There was no canvassing. It was sort of frowned on, and when it was done in later years, it was really kind of more back porch type activities where people would come literally to their porch. So in that context, it had a more tactical value. I don't really like the way it's done right now, because if you think about it, the smart way to think about this is if you're the nominee, is you want somebody who's not so exciting that they're going to upstage you, and you want somebody sufficiently boring that they're not going to embarrass you. So what I said about this before is, it all lands on the smart political decision being to basically add the junior varsity version of yourself to the ticket. And my problem with this is I don't want the junior varsity person to become president of the United States. I want the captain of the varsity team. So that's my fundamental problem with how it plays out. I think this election is going to be different, again, because of the age of the incumbent and the age of two of the four leading contenders on the Democratic side. It's also interesting to speculate about what other roles a vice president could play. So again, not making any partisan judgment one way or the other, you can imagine a situation where Elizabeth Warren wins Iowa. And who does she have a problem with? She has a problem with very wealthy donors who are concerned about her economic policy and tax policy and antitrust policy. And she has a challenge with certain types of young voters. You can imagine her saying, okay, I need help with the big donors. And you can imagine her grabbing somebody like, Mayor Pete as a strategic move to get that fundraising, because he's proven to be a very significant fundraiser, and to basically say, can you talk to all of the wealthy business people who are uncomfortable with my presidency. You can also imagine a situation where Joe Biden looks like he's going to be the winner, and despite their attention on the debate stage, decides to pick Kamala Harris, not for the reasons that people might argue he should pick her to appeal to different demographics, but because of her abilities as a prosecutor. You basically say, I want you as the VP nominee to just fight with Trump, to just prosecute Trump, just make him run against you, not against me. You can imagine that kind of a tactical play. I think an interesting question, which has never happened in the primary era, is very, very early announcements of tickets. Well before you're getting close to the point of finality. That's the thing that I think could be very interesting here. And especially if some latecomers are starting to flirt with the idea of coming in, that could be a way to prevent that from happening.
Okay, so tell us more. No, you could feel the voices. No matter what ticket you suggest, it's just, can we just hide from this whole discussion? So impeachment is one of the ways to end a presidency, right? You don't have to die. You could, right? And so my question is, you would just not talking so much about what's going to happen with this, but one of the things you pointed out in talking before was how often symbolic, or what I would call baby step filings of impeachment have happened, and I know you know all the numbers on this in terms of presidency. And so when you talk about the emphasis on how to think about a vice president, right, and what a vice president should do along the lines of Jacqueline's question, do you think that that also needs to play into the narrative that to talk to the American people about? I mean, it's not just because we have old candidates. It's because, or presidents die because they're old. But as you say, for other reasons. And, because none of this really, you see now Nikki Haley, right, throwing herself in there for obvious, self-promotion reasons to be president, to be vice president. And so I just wonder, when you say people don't really think about the vice president taking over, I'm just pushing back on that a little bit. I do think there have been a number of times in our collective lives where there has been a lot of thought that this could be the president for one reason or another, not just age. And I just wonder, and now particularly, also not because of age, but because we live in a world of such instability about so many things. We don't know what's going on. And so what I really have been thinking about is where exactly does impeachment, and so you talked about, we didn't have a mechanism for who was going to be president, right? We also don't seem to have a mechanism for how an impeachment really works. Mm-hmm. And so I guess my bigger question is, do you think that's what's going to come out of this period of time is a rethinking of the presidency in very large ways, and structurally in terms of elections, in terms of how the ticket is put together, or do you really think we're just going to muddle along and just confront one crisis after another? And just how do you see this going in terms of actual legislation or, legislation and policy? Yeah.
So on the first one, on the vice presidency, I think the American people have opinions about this. I just think when you're the candidate and you have total discretion over who you get to choose as your running mate, which I don't think is a responsible mechanism. I don't think it's a good check. I think to give the nominee that kind of power to choose somebody that the American people are going to be stuck with, I think is not a good check. I think there's lots of ways that the party at a minimum could do a check. I don't like the idea of superdelegates in terms of how they're used. I like the idea of superdelegates to have a disproportionate influence on who the running mate is. I think that's an interesting idea. But I think so. My criticism of not giving this thought is towards the candidates, not the American people, because I think the American people do think about a heartbeat away from the presidency. But when you're on the ropes in a particular election cycle, they view the VP announcement as an opportunity to gain 10 points in the poll, and you need look no further back than Sarah Palin to sort of see how that can play out. I think the thing that we want to correct for once they're in office is you don't want to have the Harry Truman situation again. It would be interesting, and because the last several, basically because all the vice presidents going, at this point, basically, going all the way back to George H.W. Bush have been pretty integrated in the administration. We haven't felt the need to do this, but had McCain Palin won, I can't imagine Palin would have been particularly integrated into the foreign policy of John McCain administration. So what legal mechanisms and protections are there to make sure she's getting briefed, making sure she has access to the intelligence, make sure she can set up a national security apparatus so that she's ready to lead on day one. I think that counterfactual is actually quite important. And I think from a historic perspective, we should be glad that she was nominated, because it's a reminder of how important that position can be. But to your question, to your other question, I mean, to me, this is an evolution of what's been happening for several hundred years. We talked about this earlier. The founding fathers made it. They clearly wanted a mechanism to hold the president accountable, because they feared monarchy. They made a decision to put the sort of mechanism for accountability in two bodies that they didn't view as they're political body. The House of Representatives is a political body. The Senate is a political body. And by all accounts, they were even more politically partisan back then than we were. I told you, I've been reading, Friends Divided and all about the feud between the Democrat-Republicans and the Federalists. So they understood how nasty partisan politics was, and they still chose to have these bodies do this mechanism of accountability. I think what they were counting on is sort of subsequent generations viewing the Constitution as a living document to be iterated on over time. But unfortunately, as it came to impeachment and accountability of the president, we went in a more political direction, right? So the first time impeachment proceedings are brought against the president is against John Tyler because Henry Clay thinks he's thwarted the Whig agenda. So that sets a precedent. Then impeachment proceedings are brought against Zachary Taylor because, again, Henry Clay feels like Zachary Taylor is standing in the way of the compromise of 1850. Then the radical Republicans, go so far as not just to bring proceedings, but actually impeach Andrew Johnson over a law that was later proven constitutional for two reasons. One, they made the mistake of thinking Johnson was a radical Republican, and then when the Civil War ended, realizing he wasn't. And two, because there was a vacancy in the vice president, the next in line was a radical Republican, the president pro tem. Because back then it was the president pro tem ahead of the speaker. And then the next time is Herbert Hoover. Those are politically motivated. Then Harry Truman has impeachment proceedings brought against him, politically motivated. And then the second president who likely would have ended up being impeached was Nixon. It's the only time in history, excluding the president, where it sort of didn't reek of political motivations, although it did in the earlier stages of the process. And then the Clinton process was heavily politicized, and then every president since Clinton has had impeachment proceedings at least put on the floor of the House of Representatives, or at least gone to committee since then. They typically don't get a lot of votes. So the question is, if you look at the current situation that we're in right now, there's no doubt, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, this is a heavily politicized process. And I think that precedent over and over again over the course of several hundred years has done a disservice to what the Founding Fathers intended for the impeachment process to do, and pushed us into a situation where we just are sort of stuck in this heavily politicized mechanism of accountability. Now, the other thing that I'll say, which is interesting, I have a personal view. I admire Bob Mueller tremendously as a patriot, and he was an extraordinary FBI director. History will judge the precedent that he set, which is that a sitting president of the United States can't be indicted. And the irony is that was, I believe, done in a very sort of apolitical way, and an attempt to, through a very objective lens. I think it was his team's interpretation. I think, unfortunately, that precedent further politicizes the process. So that's kind of where I think we're at right now, and we'll see how this all plays out.
Now, before Jared signs some books and answers some questions, we have one final question for him. The book talks a lot about accidental presidency. We hope that you are never an accidental president, but do we sense a run possibly in potential candidacy?
Pete Buttigieg and I were in grad school together, and he and I joke pretty often that every Rhodes Scholar goes to Oxford thinking they're going to run for president, and now everybody sort of is faced with the reality that he did it first and did it really well, and so the consequence is that no Rhodes Scholar for an entire generation will ever dare run for president unless they fare much worse than he has. That's a joke, by the way. Politics. I think when I was younger, I was really interested in elected politics, and I think that politics has just changed so much from when I was a kid. That's sort of obvious to all of us. But I also think the combination of politics and an environment saturated with social media, I feel like it's hard to have a family and enter politics. I also think there's a lot more ways to play a political role and play a foreign policy role than just serving government. I love my time in government, I love service, but I think I enjoy policy more than I enjoy politics. So if I went back into government, it would probably not be an elected thing. Can I tell one quick story before we, because I really became fascinated by these close calls. And a story that I love to tell is that there's two close calls of a president nearly dying in office that are just will utterly gobsmack you. The first is FDR, when he was president-elect, had just taken a 14-day fishing cruise on board Vincent Astor's mega yacht, the Norma. They arrived in Miami, and mid-February 1933, they get off the ship and they go to a park where FDR delivers a 2.5-minute brief speech. And his departure is then delayed because a radio broadcaster comes to him and says, "We didn't catch it because we didn't expect it to be so quick. Can you do it again?" That delay creates an opening for an Italian immigrant named Giuseppe Zangar to fire 5 shots in 15 seconds at FDR as president-elect. A 100-pound woman named Lillian Cross was standing next to the assassin, saw him pull his .32 caliber, moved her purse from her left arm to her right arm, smacked his arm, and thwarted his aim. He ended up killing 4 people, including the mayor of Chicago, who was visiting in town, who was replaced, by the way, by the man who created the fire hazard in the 1944 convention that deprived Wallace of the nomination. But I love this story because it's an amazing story of this woman who nobody's heard of, who, with her purse, saved FDR and saved the New Deal. But it's also interesting because the 20th Amendment was ratified 9 days before the Senate. The president-elect dies before taking the oath of office. The vice president-elect becomes president at noon on Inauguration Day. The other story is how a disgruntled postal worker who was really bitter that Joe Kennedy had bought the election for his son John in 1960 decided to quit his job, sell his house, sell his property, and take the cash to buy dynamite and a green Buick that he filled up with his dynamite. He stalked President-elect Kennedy all across the country, eventually deciding to do the deed in West Palm Beach, and was parked outside of his house. And remember, we were not, it took a long time to get Secret Service protection right, and it took an even longer time to recognize the importance of doing it for presidents-elect at scale. So he's just sitting there with enough dynamite that the head of the Secret Service at the time said was enough to blow up the entire city block, decides not to pull the trigger when Kennedy comes out because he sees one of the Kennedy children right next to him. So he follows him to church, puts the dynamite in his pants, sits in a back pew. When they came out of the church, he's standing within 4 feet of President-elect Kennedy with his hand in his pocket on the trigger. It would have blown up the entire church, including the President-elect. He saw some children out of the corner of his eye and decided to do it later. He was then pulled over for a routine traffic stop and ended up being arrested, and ended up spending the rest of his life in a hospital for the mentally ill without any due process, which is also a whole other interesting story.
So wait, so the first underwear bomber?
So I like to tell the story because we think of suicide bombers as like a modern phenomenon in the context of violent Islamist extremism, and the first modern suicide bomber that I can think of to ever almost wreak havoc on the United States was a disgruntled postal worker named Richard Pavlik.
Oh my God. All right, so we're going to have some Q&A. I'm going to stand, but I'm not going to answer the questions, just so I can see all of you, and we'll have time to get them in. So over here first.
My name is Michael Johnston. I'm an advisor to the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. And 14 years ago, I created a forum, annual forum on the presidency to study and celebrate it. It's coming up this Saturday, this year's. We are sold out. There'll be a little over 2,000 people. And as the founder, I have the privilege of making the introduction, setting the theme, and trying to study this. The Truman Library has turned out a couple of my ideas. So the one they accepted was, what have we learned from recent presidents that will help us do a better job in the future? And I guess we named the 2 Bushes, President Obama, President Clinton. We haven't yet named President Trump in that panoply. And because I'm the creator and the founder of this forum, I get to introduce the forum. The two panelists are Jeff Flake and Doris Kearns Goodwin. I welcome any suggestions you have about a brief, very brief introduction. Thank you for coming.
Okay. Yeah, we can talk. I know both of them well. They're both friends. It'll be a great panel. Yeah, and I think what Doris does so well is she answers really tough, contentious questions about the president with beautifully articulated anecdotes from history where the point is so crystal clear, but because she does it with history, it lacks the partisan baggage that often comes with more contemporary critique. And I think Jeff is a great person to ask about. I mean, what I've always admired about Jeff is he's a real zealot for human rights, and he's a real zealot for freedom of speech. And I think having served in the Senate, he'd be a very interesting person to talk to about, the sort of the flaws in the process.
Please tell us the topic of your next book.
I'm thinking about several ideas. I haven't, to be honest with you, landed on one yet. I think there's two reasons you write a book. One is you have something to say and you want to say it before someone else does. I've done that. It's not very pleasant because you're dealing with the situation of at some point you need to be done and then something happens in the news that you want to include, and the book tends to have a shorter shelf life. The other reason to write a book is you need an excuse to rationalize your hobbies if you have a day job. And like this is, I hope you can tell from my voice. I mean, what I love is being able to, like, I would speak in this room if there was one person in it because I love this topic so much. And I was telling Jacqueline before that it's the fun challenge of this has been, if I'm giving a talk in my, sort of CEO of Jigsaw, Alphabet, Google capacity, I have a different view of, like, how to think about, deciding what I talk about and so forth. This felt very much like I'm trying to, it's like starting a second career from scratch. And I view it in a lot of respects like a startup, right? You come up with an idea. It's a very saturated market. There's no shortage of people that have written about every president that I write about in this book, and many examples of people doing deeper research and writing about it much better. The craft of this book is putting it all in one place. So, like a startup, there's a market where lots of people are doing things, and you identify a gap, you build that gap, you sort of run it as a private company for 5.5 to 6 years, and then you either get acquired or take it public. For me, the IPO of this little startup was the publication of the book, and like any IPO, you don't know how it's going to be received. You're kind of an outsider to a sort of ecosystem of historians coming in, and you have all the stress reputationally and financially in terms of just the amount of time that you spent on it, since time is a valuable resource. Like if you wasted 6 years, it's not like, I think you kind of have to count that as a loss if the book doesn't land. So I'm going through the same process as I think about my other ideas. I'm very interested in the partisan politics of the Adams-Jefferson era and the partisan politics of today, and the fact that most of the polarization in between was sectional and geographic, not purely political party. So I think that's kind of interesting. I'm interested in the father-son presidencies of the Adamses and the Bushes and how they sort of compare and contrast. I find the sort of ex-president chapters of history to be often forgotten and interesting. I'm interested in the relationship between FDR and Vincent Astor. It was the first relationship between a president and a billionaire. So I find that kind of interesting. So yeah, I mean, lots of ideas. I don't know what I'll do next though. I think my wife will kill me if I write another book.
In the Federalist Papers and in the early days of our republic, the founders were quite concerned about faction, and of course in the process, in our nomination and selection of presidential and vice presidential candidates, the primary system emerged, really with Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, and you probably have read Jeff Cowan's book about that. But my question is, what would you say, or what would you think about a constitutional process for actually selecting candidates for president? Because we don't have that now. We don't have anything like that. And certainly it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to two parties. But we have the Constitution is completely silent on where these people come from and who and what they represent.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think I fully suspect that what this presidency, but we also forget, maybe Reagan had sort of unusual origins, but he had served as a major governor on his way to the presidency. I think that the precedent of President Trump in office is, I think that it will unlock a lot of new paths to the presidency. It just sort of changes the way we think about it creates an ambiguous category of one's journey to the presidency, and I think that we will see more crowded fields. I think we'll see more non-traditional candidates. I think we're going to really stress test this country's appetite to be entertained. I have a theory, I'm not going to write a book about this, but I have a theory that it'd be really interesting to go back to the first episode of The Real World in the early 90s and trace the history of reality television and its proliferation, then looking at the inflection point of social media, which is really a further proliferation of that, and look at the impact it's had on our political system. I think that would be an interesting political science study, if there's any political scientists in the room. We know I'll maybe fund that. But I think when you're talking about constitutional mechanisms or particular amendments, what's interesting about the Founding Fathers is they had the foresight to make it very hard to change the Constitution. And I think that was a very good insight, because it should be a very high bar. That being said, I don't think that they would have accounted for us being in the current situation that we're in. I think they expected there to be a level of objectivity around. So even in those early partisan days, the language was more vitriolic, it was nastier, but they were debating issues of incredible importance, and regardless of where they sat on one side of an issue or another, there was a genuine desire to resolve these issues, because from the birth of our nation, we saw civil war on the horizon, right? So, and then the other difference is not a lot of people participated in government, right? So the downside of that is we excluded most of the public. The manifestation of that is everybody who was involved in partisan politics was pretty well educated and went to the handful of universities, and so it was a small, insulated kind of group. So it was sort of it just had way fewer people involved, and that's before you even add population growth. So I think they couldn't have anticipated this, but I think we're in a situation now where it's very hard for me to imagine. I'm just skeptical of ever seeing a constitutional amendment while I'm alive, and probably successive generations, having anything to do with the electoral process. I just did this, and if you look at what's required for a constitutional amendment and how many equities there are, I'm just deeply skeptical we'll see it. That being said, I don't think that means go through the exercise of thinking through these things, because one, I could be wrong, two, it's true until it's not.
Other questions over here.
I'm curious about the recent, about the power of the vice presidency and how that has changed particularly recently, and how you see that influencing the executive maybe, or even just the vice presidency going forward.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I did a bunch of interviews. I couldn't interview people for most of the chapters in this book, but at least starting with FDR, the sort of FDR to Truman and Kennedy to Johnson chapter, I was able to interview a number of interesting people for this book. So I did several interviews with George H.W. Bush while he was alive, a number of interviews with Henry Kissinger, a very long interview with Dick Cheney, and a number of others. And this was one of the topics that we talked at length about. And Kissinger had a very funny view of this, because he acknowledged that basically since George H.W. Bush, the vice president has played a more integrated role, particularly around foreign policy. But he said until recently, part of the reason the vice president was kept at a distance is it was very annoying. As president of the United States, it was very annoying to have the person around who would most benefit from your mortality. I think he was like half joking but half serious. I think so. Let's start constitutionally. So constitutionally, the vice president basically has two responsibilities: break a tie in the Senate / preside over the Senate, and have a pulse. That's it. So anything beyond that comes from a mandate given to the vice president by the president. What's interesting is until recently, the one exception, the one vice president throughout sort of way past history that by all accounts had a very close relationship with the president, but also had influence over the president. I mean, there's something. Wallace and FDR they legitimately had a close relationship, and FDR did utilize him. But the one that really influenced the president was Garrett Hobart, because he was McKinley's bookkeeper. He did all of his finances. He did all. McKinley's life was tied up in Hobart's craft. And you can sort of, Coolidge, and Harding had a certainly a better relationship than a lot of others. But I think that it's really an issue of mandate. I like this current model a lot more. Whether you like the vice president or not, whether you like the vice president's views or not, you should have a very strong opinion. So let's take Mike Pence as an example. Some people like him, some people don't. Some people agree with his policy, some people don't. You should be very happy that Mike Pence is deeply involved in foreign policy and deeply involved in domestic policy and understands everything that's going on in this administration, has the relationships on the Hill, has the relationships in all three branches of government, because you have a 70, how old is President Trump? Mid-70s. You have a mid-70s president, and you want your vice president to be able to start leading on day one. So I think that's the reason to increase the vice president's power. Now, the handicap for a president is you can't fire them. So you can't decide I want to get rid of my vice president. You can exile them to the political equivalent of Elba, but you can't fire them.
Other questions, Mark? And then, and we're going to take these two questions in a row and then answer them at the same time, just to make sure we get them.
Thanks, Karen. In light of what you told us about your passions, I'm very surprised that you haven't discussed Nixon, Agnew, and Ford. What was your thinking there, given the distinct possibility of an accidental President Agnew?
Yeah, so I decided. So as I mentioned at the beginning, sorry, you wanted to take that?
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
I really wanted to focus on presidents that died in office because of that sense of deprival of the voter's choice. Right? Whereas in the case of Nixon, you could argue that the mechanisms. Again, this is the one instance where the mechanisms of government were holding the president accountable, and it was man-made. What's interesting about it, and I do talk about it in the last chapter of the book, and I include some interesting interviews there. The 25th Amendment, which formalizes the precedent set by John Tyler, the vice president becomes president, did something. It's ratified in 1967. It does something else, which is really interesting, which is until 1967, there's no mechanism to replace the vice president of the United States. So the 8 times that a president died in office, the vice presidency remained vacant all the way until the next election, right? And that's interesting because of those accidental presidents, 6 of the 8 themselves nearly died in office, like really, really close call, nearly died in office. And the Constitution was very clear that depending on which chapter of history, either the President pro tem, the Speaker of the House, or the Secretary of State becomes an acting president. So the first time the 25th Amendment is used is to basically pluck Gerald Ford from Michigan's 5th District to replace Spiro T. Agnew. And what's interesting is when Nixon resigns and Ford becomes president, we forget Gerald Ford was shot and nearly killed twice in just 35 days. Sarah Jane Moore took shots at him, and Lynette Squeaky Fromm took shots at him. And in the case of Lynette Squeaky Fromm, she basically shot him at point blank and left the safety on by mistake. And in the case of Sarah Jane Moore, a Secret Service agent got his finger between her and the trigger and thwarted her aim. There's another twist to this story that Dick Cheney told me, because he was deputy chief of staff at the time. In the case of Sarah Jane Moore, he came down, he was coming down the elevator to greet the crowd. It was one of those elevators that open vertically. And it hit him on the top of the head and it cracked his skull open. So he had to go back up, get stitches in his head, and then he came back down and Sarah Jane Moore took 2 shots at him. So he's like, that was a really bad day for the president.
It's funny that you would mention the 25th Amendment. That was like perfect. I think fate is in the room because Dean Furyk is here, who I always tell everybody who wrote the 25th Amendment, but anyway, whose center is basically responsible for educating all of us, not just here at Fordham, about what it is, how to use it, why we're not using it in certain circumstances, and how it functions. And so, perfect timing. And so now, John, please ask something about the 25th Amendment.
My name is John Rogan, and actually co-taught a clinic with Dean Furyk on the presidential succession system, where the students came up with recommendations to address some of the remaining issues. Now, I mean, you mentioned earlier that the framers didn't really fully deal with the issues around presidential succession. The 25th Amendment did a lot to clarify those issues. One of the interesting things is that no presidents have died since the 25th Amendment's ratification. So your book doesn't address them for that reason. But I was wondering your thoughts about a potential accidental president scenario going forward. You know, if it were to happen now, what the framework, if the framework is really ready to address it effectively, and how it might look under this new legal framework that didn't exist in the scenarios that the book does deal with.
Yeah, and it's great to have Dean here, whose books and articles I actually cited extensively in mine, and it was incredible. His work was some of the earliest that I read for this. So thank you for that. It's great to have you here. There's in my interview with Vice President Cheney, I didn't end up including this in the book because the book was just getting too long. It's funny, there's no human being, maybe other than Dean Furyk, who's thought more about presidential succession than Dick Cheney. And I mean, really, it's interesting. He goes administration by administration and how he thought about it, and you can see him getting sort of hyped up on it. And he pointed out something very interesting. He said when they came in for the transition, he wanted to basically poke holes in the succession process to figure out what was missing. And he said the biggest gap that he identified, which is the 25th Amendment doesn't have a provision for what you do if the vice president is incapacitated or disabled to the point where competence is required. So and he was worried because he joked, he said, I'd had a couple heart attacks. And so he had one of his aides sort of research this and look into it and confirm that it was in fact the case, and maybe it is, and I haven't gone that deep. But he had his aide write a letter of resignation that he signed, and then he had his aide put it in a safe in his house. Not Cheney's house, in his aide's house. And then, like a year later, his aide's house burned down with a letter. And I just thought that was an incredible story, but it is interesting. That's the level of depth that he went to. I think the closest, and I think in many respects, if you look at the most hotly debated aspect of the 25th Amendment, right, it's this question of the cabinet, voting to remove the president. This predates the 25th Amendment, but if you go back to James Garfield being shot and being on his deathbed, the deliberations between the cabinet were very interesting, and Chester Arthur's actions at this moment are very interesting, because the cabinet, in that context, had all sorts of crazy ideas, including, signing the president's name on his behalf and a variety of other things. And Arthur, who by all accounts was the most insubordinate vice president in the history of the Republic, actively working against his own administration and his own president, had such a dramatic change of heart after the president was shot. Spent the entire 80 days that Garfield was on his deathbed desperately, 4 months on his deathbed, trying to get in to see the First Lady to clear his good name for not being responsible for the assassination. And it ended up putting him in this position where he really kept the cabinet in check. I always wonder, I haven't come across any evidence that when Wilson was incapacitated, anybody was looking at the Garfield and Arthur precedent, but I do wonder sometimes, had that precedent not been set, how things would be different for Wilson. But those were both physical incapacities, and most of how it's being debated today is really about mental faculties, and there's not really there's not a precedent for that I'm aware of, and certainly not one in a post-25th Amendment environment. So, like all things, these things all sound great until you have to be the one to set the precedent, and you need to look no further than John Hinckley shooting Ronald Reagan in 1981, where by all accounts that should have been a perfect first test of what to do when the president is incapacitated, and it turns out the only time the 25th Amendment has ever been put in practice to temporarily discharge the duties to the vice president has been for colonoscopies.
So we're out of time. I'm sorry, and we want to have time to sign some books and buy some books, because how would you not want to read all these stories? There's these and more. But my job is to tell us what the takeaways are. So the couple takeaways. One, it's really a good thing to follow your passions. That's and it shows in this book, and so that's what all of you should be doing. Go home, just do whatever your passion takes you, but you should have a day job. But it really is nice, and it's nice to hear it. Second thing, it's so interesting how we don't deal with things until we have to. That's one of the takeaways of this book, and also this conversation, we'll get to that when we have to get to it, which is not perhaps the best way to run anything, but especially a country. And the third thing is that there is so much energy in your work and also your conversation about thinking about the things we need to think about without waiting for that moment. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank the Feerick Center for helping us with this event. And I want to remind you all of two things. One, don't forget that on Thursday our new publication, Vital Interest, comes out. I think this is our 8th or 9th issue, and it's a really good one. It's on little different things. It's on the criminal court and on the Balkans, but it's great. And just instead of just being in the moment, reflect on what's really happening in the world and how to think about it in terms of our national security concerns. And two, don't forget to come on Monday night for our presidential misconduct forum. I think it's going to be a blast. So, and if you have any questions about it, Julie can answer it. So, and finally, thank you to Jacqueline for helping out, and thank you so much, Jared. Come back. He has the books here. Right? So I was going to say right here. Yeah.
And you need a pen. You need a pen. Perfect.
Is that fun?
That's great. Thank you for having me. It's great. It'll be.
I don't have your email. Do you mind if I take it and I can follow up?
It's just very
You can get it right to him. No, that was me excited for you.
Excellent. That was great. And I already bought this book because I was reading it over the summer. It was really great.
Am I signing it to you, or?
That'd be great.
John. J-O-H-N.
Hey, it was so nice to see you. Hi. It was great to see you there. I have a 9:30 meeting that I have to.
How are you?
So nice to see you. I'm good. Julia, can you move the
thank you.
sign to me? Yeah. How are you? We've been asking you, where the hell did you go? You disappeared? You what? Are you okay?
Yeah, I mean, it's still kind of just trying to figure
Looking
out.
around, trying to figure it out. Well, I'm really glad to see you.